Pacific Islanders, Pacifica, or Pacifica, are the peoples of the Pacific Islands, particularly those who are indigenous to them. As an ethnic, racial term, it is used to describe the original peoples, inhabitants and diaspora, of any of the three major subregions of Oceania. It is also sometimes used as a general geographic term, describing any inhabitants of the Pacific Islands. As Pacific Islander can be understood to denote both indigenous and non-indigenous peoples of the Pacific Islands, as well as excluding Aboriginal Australians. The term is distinct from referring to the indigenous peoples of Oceania. Polynesians include native Hawaiians, Tahitians, Mariana Islanders, the Yapese, Cosrians. Melanesian include Fijians, and the Ni Vanuatu. Auckland, New Zealand has the world's largest concentration of urban Pacific Islanders living outside of their own countries, and is sometimes referred to as the Polynesian capital of the world. This came as a result of how, during the 20th century and into the 21st century, the country saw a steady stream of immigration from Polynesian countries such as Samoa, Tonga, the Cook Islands, Niue, and French Polynesia. The Pacific Islands consist of three main regions. The Polynesian Islands are scattered across a triangle covering the east-central region of the Pacific Ocean. The triangle is bound by the Hawaiian Islands in the north, New Zealand in the west, and Easter Island in the east. The rest of Polynesia includes the Samoan Islands, Cook Islands, French Polynesia, Niue Island, Tokelau and Tuvalu, Tonga, Wallis and Futuna, Rotem Island, Pitcairn Island, Nukoro, and Kapingamarangi. Melanesia is the great arc of islands located north and east of Australia and south of the equator. The name derives the Greek words Melis, New Caledonia, and Fiji. In addition, those places listed above. Melanesia includes the Louisiade Archipelago, the Admiralty Islands, Bougainville Island, Papua New Guinea, Western New Guinea, Norfolk Island, and various smaller islands. Micronesia includes Kiribati, Nauru, the Marianas, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, Palau, and the Federated States of Micronesia. The population of the Pacific Islands is concentrated in Papua New Guinea, New Zealand, Hawaii, Fiji, and Solomon Islands. Most Pacific Islands are densely populated, and habitation tends to be concentrated along the coasts. Melanesians constitute over 3/4 of the total indigenous population of the Pacific Islands. Polynesians account for more than 1/6, and Micronesians make up about 1/20. Several hundred distinct languages are spoken in the Pacific Islands. In ethno-linguistic terms, those Pacific Islanders who reside in Oceania are divided into two different ethnic classifications. The umbrella term Pacific Islands may take on several meanings. Sometimes it refers to only those islands covered by the region of Oceania. In some common uses, the term refers to the islands of the Pacific Ocean once colonized by the Portuguese, Spaniards, Dutch, British, French, United States, and Japanese, such as the Pitcairn Islands, Taiwan, and Borneo. In other uses, it may refer to islands with Austronesian linguistic heritage like Taiwan, Indonesia, Micronesia, Polynesia, Myanmar Islands, which found their genesis in the Neolithic cultures of the island of Taiwan. In Australia, the term South Sea Islander was used to describe Australian descendants of people from the over 80 islands in the Western Pacific who had been brought to Australia to work on the sugar fields of Queensland. These people were called Kanakas in the 19th century. The Pacific Island Labourers Act 1901 was enacted to restrict entry of Pacific Islanders to Australia and to authorize their deportation. In this legislation, Pacific Islanders were defined as Pacific Island labourer, includes all natives not of European extraction of any island except the islands of New Zealand situated in the Pacific Ocean beyond the Commonwealth as constituted at the commencement of this act. In 2008, a Pacific Seasonal Worker Pilot Scheme was announced as a 3-year pilot experiment. It provides visas for workers from Kiribati, Tonga, Vanuatu, and Papua New Guinea to work in Australia. Aside from Papua New Guinea, The scheme includes one country each from Melanesia, countries that already send workers to New Zealand under its seasonal labour scheme. Local usage in New Zealand uses Pacific Islander to distinguish those who have emigrated from one of these areas in modern times from the New Zealand Maori, who are also Polynesian but are indigenous to New Zealand. In the 2013 New Zealand census, 7.4% of the New Zealand population identified with one or more Pacific ethnic groups, although 62.3% of these were born in New Zealand. Those with a Samoan background make up the largest proportion, followed by Cook Islands Maori, Tongan, and Niuean. Some smaller island populations such as Niue and Tokal